He was just 11 years old, a Yankees cap tilted on his head, a soda in his hand. One second, Jacob Miller was cheering with his parents at a baseball game in Cleveland. The next, he was gone. No screams, no trail, just silence. And a cap left behind on the sticky stadium floor. 17 years later, a photographer flips through her crowd shots from another game and freezes. Because in the middle of 30,000 fans, she spots a man, older now, but unmistakable, wearing the exact same cap. This is the story of a boy who vanished in plain sight, of a family who never stopped searching, and of a single photograph that would change everything. Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you watching from? I read every single comment, and I love seeing our community interact. The summer evening in Cleveland had all the markings of a perfect night for baseball. The sun dipped low behind the steel beams of Progressive Field, staining the sky with streaks of orange and purple. Vendors shouted over one another. The smell of buttered popcorn and sizzling hot dogs floated through the air, and the crowd roared in waves that seemed to shake the concrete beneath their feet. In the middle of it all, the Miller family threaded their way through the bustling concourse. Michael Miller carried 2 sodas balanced precariously in one hand, while Laura kept a tight grip on her son's small fingers. 11-year-old Jacob wore his Yankees cap proudly, though they were surrounded by Cleveland fans. He didn't care. His father had given him that cap on his 10th birthday, and he wore it like a badge of honor. Jacob's eyes darted everywhere. To him, the stadium was a wonderland. Flashing scoreboards, the metallic clang of vendors opening ice chests, the sound of a bat cracking against a fastball echoing like thunder. Every sense was overwhelmed, every detail larger than life. He craned his neck to see a man juggling peanuts, tugged his mother's sleeve when a player's face appeared on the jumbotron, laughed when a group of college students started chanting in unison. The Millers finally found their section and squeezed past rows of strangers, the sticky floor clinging to their sneakers. Jacob's seat was right at the aisle, close enough to feel the vibration of each cheer, close enough to hear the thud of a ball smacking a mitt. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, eyes wide and alive. But in a stadium that held more than 30,000 people, chaos was only ever a heartbeat away. Somewhere in the 7th inning, as the wave of fans rose and fell like a living ocean, Laura loosened her hand from Jacob's for just a moment to grab her drink. Michael turned to check the score on the overhead screen. And Jacob, curious, restless, slipped into the aisle, his cap bobbing above the crowd as he followed the laughter of kids a few rows down. It happened in seconds. One moment his small frame was visible among the throng of bodies shifting and cheering. The next, he was gone. At first, Laura thought he had ducked down to tie his shoe or that he was weaving his way back through the seats. She called his name, "Jacob!" But her voice was swallowed by the crowd's roar as a batter connected with a fastball. Michael stood, scanning left and right, his sodas spilling onto the concrete. The laughter and chatter of strangers blurred into a single, dizzying hum. Then Laura saw it. Jacob's Yankees cap lying on the sticky floor near the aisle, trampled by rushing feet. Her heart seized. The game went on. The scoreboard lit up. Fireworks cracked in the sky. Fans cheered with wild abandon. But for the Millers, time stopped. Their son had vanished in the middle of 30,000 people, and not a single soul seemed to notice. Jacob Miller was the kind of boy people described as quiet, but full of wonder. He wasn't loud. He wasn't the kid who demanded attention, but when he walked into a room, his presence carried a certain innocence that drew people in. At 11 years old, he still carried with him that childlike awe for the smallest details, the way fireflies lit up the backyard in the summer, the way the smell of fresh-cut grass clung to his sneakers, the way baseball felt less like a sport and more like magic. At home, Jacob's world was simple, yet not without its fractures. The Miller family lived in a modest house on the east side of Cleveland, a place where the neighbors all knew each other's names, and kids rode their bikes down cracked sidewalks until the streetlights came on. His mother, Laura, was the anchor, organized, protective, the type of parent who saved every school project and wrote notes in his lunchbox. His father, Michael, was quieter. A man who worked long hours at a steel plant, he often came home exhausted. But baseball had always been his way to bond with his son. That Yankees cap Jacob wore so proudly wasn't just a piece of clothing. It was a bridge between him and his father. Michael had saved up to surprise him with tickets to see the Yankees play when they came to Cleveland. To Jacob, it was more than a game. It was a dream, seeing his heroes up close, sharing nachos with his dad, cheering until his voice gave out. He was the kind of kid who asked too many questions at the dinner table. Why is the sky blue? How does the pitcher throw a curveball? What makes thunder so loud? Laura answered patiently, always amused by his curiosity, while Michael usually grinned, shaking his head, proud of how sharp his boy was becoming. But Jacob had his fragilities, too. He wasn't the most confident in school. He struggled with math, dreaded standing in front of the class for presentations, and sometimes got teased for being smaller than the other boys. Laura would encourage him, telling him that one day his quiet strength would matter more than size or loudness. Still, Jacob often felt like he had something to prove, both to himself and to the world. He dreamed of being a baseball player, but more than that, he dreamed of belonging somewhere beyond the walls of his small neighborhood. He collected baseball cards religiously, studying the faces, memorizing the stats, and imagining what it must be like to stand in front of thousands of cheering fans. In his notebooks, he doodled stadiums, uniforms, and even designs for gloves that could never drop a ball. Yet, behind the daydreams, Jacob carried a sensitivity that made him deeply empathetic. He couldn't walk past a stray dog without trying to pet it, couldn't see a classmate sitting alone without feeling torn about whether to join them. It was that same sensitivity that made Laura worry, because while it made Jacob kind, it also made him vulnerable. In the weeks before the game, Jacob had been buzzing with anticipation. Every night he'd ask his father how many days were left. Every morning he'd check the weather forecast, afraid rain would cancel the match. Laura remembered the way his eyes lit up when Michael finally handed him the ticket. It was a memory that stayed etched in her mind like a photograph. That night at the stadium, Jacob wasn't just another kid in a crowd of thousands. He was a boy, carrying the weight of his dreams in a baseball cap. A boy who wanted nothing more than to share a game with his father and maybe, just maybe, catch a fly ball that would feel like destiny in his hands. And yet, destiny had something else planned. In the days that followed Jacob's disappearance, the stadium became less a place of joy and more a haunted landmark for the Millers. Police officers combed through every corridor, every concession stand, every restroom. Volunteers searched the parking lots with flashlights well into the night. Flyers with Jacob's school photo, him grinning, 2 teeth slightly crooked, wearing that Yankees cap, were plastered on every telephone pole in Cleveland. At first, people assumed it was a simple case of a boy getting lost in the crowd. The stadium was massive, after all. Maybe he had wandered too far. Maybe he had gotten separated in the crush of fans leaving their seats after a big play. But as hours turned into days, the story grew darker. Detective Harris, a veteran of missing persons cases, sat with Laura and Michael in their living room. His notepad rested on his knee, but his eyes were heavy with the weight of too many parents he had comforted before. "Someone must have seen him," Laura pleaded, her hands shaking. "You don't just vanish in a place like that." But that was the first strange sign. Out of 30,000 people, not one had a clear memory of Jacob leaving his seat. Some said they might have seen a boy heading toward the concession stands. Others thought they noticed him near the restrooms, but every detail contradicted the last. No single account lined up. Security footage should have helped, but in 2006 the system wasn't as sophisticated as it is today. Cameras covered entrances and exits, but there were blind spots, wide concourses packed with fans where Jacob could have slipped from view in seconds. Investigators replayed every second of tape, but there was no sign of a boy in a Yankees cap leaving the stadium. It was as if he had evaporated between one frame and the next. Then came the whispers. A vendor claimed he saw a man holding Jacob's hand, guiding him through the crowd, but when pressed, he couldn't describe the man's face. Another fan swore they heard a child calling "Mom" near the parking garage, but by the time they looked, there was only silence. Stranger still was the discovery of Jacob's cap. Laura had been certain she saw it trampled near the aisle, but when police returned later, it was gone. Days later, the cap appeared again, this time on the stadium's outer grounds, near a fence where the grass met the asphalt of the service road. How had it gotten there? Who had moved it? As weeks stretched into months, the Miller family's life became a cycle of false hope and crushing disappointment. Calls came in constantly, sightings of boys who looked like Jacob in malls, at bus stops, even across state lines. Each tip sent detectives racing, but every single one ended the same: another child, another family, another dead end. But some clues gnawed at Detective Harris. Stadium workers spoke of a man who had been hanging around for weeks before the game, loitering near gates, pretending to sell tickets. No one knew his name. No one had seen him since that night. And buried in the chaos of eyewitness reports, a single detail emerged again and again: a figure in a dark jacket, lingering near the aisle where Jacob had been sitting. 17 years later, long after the case had gone cold, the strangeness returned with a vengeance. It started with a photograph. Sarah Collins, a local photographer, had been flipping through old prints she had taken during a game at Progressive Field the previous summer. In one wide shot of the cheering crowd, something caught her attention. There, halfway up the section, was a man in his late 20s, his face partly shadowed by the brim of a Yankees cap. His expression was guarded, almost tense, as if he wasn't celebrating like those around him. Sarah didn't think much of it at first, until she noticed the uncanny resemblance: the shape of his jaw, the tilt of his eyes, and that cap. The exact same style from 2006, worn and frayed, identical to the one Jacob Miller had been wearing the night he vanished. Sarah's chest tightened. She pulled up Jacob's missing person flyer on her phone and held it beside the photo. The resemblance was impossible to ignore. Could it really be him, sitting in the crowd of the very stadium where he disappeared all those years ago? She hesitated for days before contacting the authorities, but when she finally did, the photo set off a storm. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, the Miller case was alive again. The photo spread like wildfire. Within days, news stations in Cleveland and beyond were broadcasting the grainy image of the man in the Yankees cap, alongside the familiar childhood photo of Jacob Miller. Anchors asked the same question over and over: could this finally be him? For Laura, it was like reopening a wound that had never truly healed. She stared at the television screen, tears welling in her eyes, whispering, "That's my boy. I know it is." Michael was quieter. He sat with his hands clasped, his jaw tight. "We can't get our hopes up again," he muttered. They had ridden this roller coaster too many times: tips, sightings, promises, only to be devastated each time. But deep down, even Michael couldn't shake the feeling that this time was different. Detective Harris, now retired but still haunted by the case, returned to the Miller home when he heard the news. His hair was grayer, his shoulders heavier, but his determination was the same. "I never forgot Jacob," he said, sliding the photograph across the table. "If there's even a chance this is him, we need to follow it." The renewed investigation began with the basics, tracking down Sarah Collins, the photographer. She explained where she had been sitting, what section she had photographed, and the exact date of the game. Detectives enlarged the photo, sharpening the pixels until the man's features grew clearer. The resemblance was undeniable. His nose, the curve of his chin, the faint scar on his left eyebrow that Jacob had gotten after falling off his bike at age 8, it was all there. But the photo only raised more questions. If it was Jacob, why had he returned to the stadium? Why sit in plain view, in the very place he vanished? And why not come home? Detectives canvassed the stadium again, this time interviewing fans who had been in the same section that night. Some recalled a man sitting alone, withdrawn, not cheering. One vendor remembered him buying a soda and quietly slipping cash onto the counter without a word. No one knew his name. No one saw him leave. Meanwhile, Laura became obsessed. She printed the photo, taped it to the refrigerator, carried a copy in her purse. She began to dream about Jacob again, not as a boy, but as the man in the photo, his face half hidden under the brim of that cap. She imagined walking up the stadium steps, reaching for him, only for the crowd to swallow him all over again. Michael struggled with the resurgence of hope. He had built walls around his grief for years, convinced himself that Jacob was gone. To believe otherwise felt dangerous. "What if he doesn't want to be found?" Michael asked one night, his voice barely above a whisper. The question hung in the air like smoke. Detectives began chasing leads with renewed urgency. They contacted shelters, hospitals, even checked employment records for men matching Jacob's age and description. Several false alarms followed, a man in Detroit who looked similar, another in Chicago. Each time Laura's heart soared and then shattered when it wasn't him. But then came something no one expected. A former stadium employee came forward after seeing the photo on the news. He remembered the night Jacob vanished. More importantly, he remembered a man in a dark jacket near the service road behind the stadium, holding the hand of a boy in a Yankees cap. He had dismissed it at the time, assuming it was a father and son, but after 17 years, the memory returned with alarming clarity. The revelation deepened the mystery. If Jacob had been taken that night, who had taken him? And if the man in the photo really was Jacob, what had kept him from coming back? Fear? Shame? Or something far more sinister? For Laura, the questions were unbearable. She drove to Progressive Field one afternoon, stood outside the gates, and pressed her palm against the cool steel bars. "Jacob," she whispered, her voice breaking, "if you're out there, come home." But silence was her only answer. And still, the photo lingered, an image frozen in time, taunting everyone who looked at it with the possibility that Jacob Miller was alive. The investigation reached a breaking point when Detective Harris pushed the photo to the federal level. The FBI agreed to run the image through advanced facial recognition software, comparing it against thousands of databases, driver's licenses, passports, employment records. For days, the Millers heard nothing. Laura barely slept, clutching her phone every night as if the call itself might summon Jacob back to her. Then the call came. The software had produced a likely match, a man named David Miller, no relation, living under a fabricated Social Security number in a working-class neighborhood just 20 minutes outside Cleveland. Age, 28. No official employment history, rent, paid in cash. And most striking of all, his photo matched almost perfectly with the boy who had vanished 17 years earlier. Detectives moved quickly, setting up quiet surveillance. From a parked car across the street, they watched as the man came and went from a small, run-down apartment. He kept to himself, avoided neighbors, and never stayed out late. But the Yankees cap was always there, perched low on his head, as if it were a shield against the world. Laura begged to see him, but Harris held her back. "If it's him, we need to be careful," he warned. "We don't know what he's been through. We don't know who he's with." After a week of watching, investigators made their move. They approached him in the early evening, just as he was unlocking his apartment door. The man froze, his shoulders stiffening, the keys trembling in his hand. When Harris said the name Jacob, something flickered in his eyes. Fear, recognition, denial, all at once. At the station, the truth began to surface piece by piece. At first, he refused to speak, but when DNA results confirmed his identity beyond any doubt, the silence shattered. He was Jacob Miller. The revelation rocked Cleveland. Headlines screamed, "Boy who vanished at stadium found alive after 17 years." For the Millers, it was both a miracle and a torment. Their son was alive, but he was a stranger now, carrying years of secrets that no one could yet understand. When Jacob finally spoke, his voice was soft, halting, as though he were learning how to trust language again. He described being led away from the stadium that night by a man he thought he recognized. A distant cousin on his father's side, someone who had attended a few family barbecues. Jacob had been told his parents were waiting outside, that there was a surprise waiting for him, but once they reached the service road, everything changed. The cousin, Mark, was deep in debt and desperate. He took Jacob, not out of malice, but as leverage, hoping to pressure the family for money. But when the plan fell apart, he disappeared into the underbelly of the city, dragging Jacob with him. What followed were years of secrecy and manipulation. Mark convinced Jacob that his parents had stopped searching, that the world believed he was dead, that there was no home to return to. For a child, the lies became reality, and as Jacob grew, the chains of fear tightened. Even after Mark died suddenly from an overdose when Jacob was 17, the damage was done. Jacob was left alone, without identity, without the courage to return to the life he had lost. "I wanted to come home," he whispered during his interview, tears streaking his face. "But I didn't know if you'd even want me. I thought I was forgotten." The words gutted Laura. She reached across the table, trembling, and touched her son's hand for the first time in nearly 2 decades. "You were never forgotten," she said through sobs. "Not for a single day." But with the revelation came deeper wounds. Michael, who had blamed himself all these years, now struggled with rage. How had a member of their own family done this? How had no one seen the signs? Harris, too, carried guilt. He had interviewed Mark in the early days of the case, but dismissed him when nothing suspicious turned up. The truth had been there all along, hiding in plain sight. The city reeled. Neighbors who had once brought casseroles during the search now watched the news in stunned silence. Support groups spoke Jacob's name as a beacon of both tragedy and resilience. And the Millers faced the impossible task of rebuilding a family from the fragments of time lost. Yet, even in the middle of the storm, one question burned brighter than all the rest. Why had Jacob returned to Progressive Field last summer, sitting in the stands where it all began? The first night Jacob spent back at his parents' house was nothing like the joyful homecoming Laura had imagined for 17 years. The old bedroom she had kept untouched, posters curling on the walls, a stack of baseball cards still on the dresser, felt foreign to him. He sat on the edge of the bed, running his fingers over the dusty surface, as though he were a guest in someone else's childhood. Laura hovered in the doorway, torn between wanting to embrace him and fearing she might overwhelm him. Do you remember this room?" she asked softly. Jacob nodded faintly, his eyes distant. "Some of it feels like it belongs to someone else." His voice cracked, and Laura's chest tightened. She crossed the room and sat beside him, sliding her arm around his shoulders. He didn't pull away. Michael, on the other hand, struggled. He lingered in the hallway, unable to step inside. For years he had imagined this moment, But now that it was real, he couldn't reconcile the boy he lost with the man sitting in front of him. "I should have protected you," he muttered one evening, his voice sharp with self-blame. "If I hadn't taken you to that game—" "Dad," Jacob interrupted, looking up with pleading eyes. "Don't, please. None of this was your fault." But Michael couldn't let go so easily. The guilt had calcified over 17 years, and breaking it apart would take time. As days passed, the family tried to adjust. Jacob joined them for dinners, though he often ate in silence. He accompanied Laura to the grocery store once, flinching every time someone brushed past him in the aisle. The world was overwhelming, too bright, too loud, too fast. Years of living in the shadows had trained him to be invisible, and now he was being thrust into the center of attention. The community responded with a mix of compassion and curiosity. Some neighbors dropped off flowers and cards, while others whispered behind closed doors, speculating about what really happened. Jacob felt their eyes on him, and sometimes he wished the photo had never surfaced at all. Still, there were moments of healing. One evening, Laura brought out an old box of VHS tapes and slid one into the player. The screen flickered to life, showing Jacob at age 7 swinging a plastic bat in the backyard while Michael pitched underhand. The grainy footage filled the living room with laughter from a past that seemed unreachable. Jacob watched in silence, tears slipping down his cheeks. "I didn't think I'd ever hear that sound again," he whispered. Slowly, Jacob began to share pieces of his story. Late at night, he told Laura about the cramped apartments, the lies he had been fed, the years of loneliness. "I used to sit by the window," he confessed, "and imagine you walking down the street to find me. I almost believed you would." Laura's heart broke, but she also felt a strange kind of relief. For so long she had wondered what Jacob's life had been like, and now she finally knew. Forgiveness became the hardest part. Not for Jacob, he didn't blame his parents, but for Michael and Laura, forgiving themselves and the lost years was a battle. "We missed your first high school dance," Laura whispered one night, clutching Jacob's hand. "We missed so much." "You didn't miss me," Jacob replied. "You kept me alive. Every time you searched, every time you hoped. I felt it, even if I didn't know it." The words lit something inside Laura that had long been dark. But the deepest emotional moment came when Jacob asked to return to Progressive Field. Michael hesitated, but Jacob insisted. "I need to see it," he said firmly. One evening, the three of them stood outside the gates as the sun dipped low, the same orange glow painting the sky that had shone the night he vanished. Jacob's hands trembled, but he lifted his chin. He pointed to their old section, his voice shaking. "That's where I was sitting." Laura wrapped her arms around him, and for the first time Jacob leaned into the embrace fully. He closed his eyes, letting the sounds of the city wash over him, not as chains, but as proof that he had survived. The family was far from whole, but in that moment they felt something close to healing. In the months that followed, life for the Millers did not return to normal, because normal was something that had been lost the night Jacob vanished. Instead, they built something new, fragile but real. Therapy sessions helped Jacob untangle years of lies, while Laura and Michael learned to navigate the guilt and grief that had lived inside them for nearly 2 decades. The past couldn't be erased, but slowly the weight of silence began to lift. Jacob started taking small steps into the world again. He applied for a library card, found part-time work at a hardware store, and even joined a local community baseball league, not as a player, but as a quiet spectator on the sidelines. Watching the crack of the bat and the cheer of the crowd no longer filled him with fear. Instead, it reminded him of who he used to be and who he might become again. The Yankees cap, once a symbol of loss, became something else entirely. He still wore it often, but now it wasn't about hiding. It was about remembering the boy he was, the family who never stopped searching, and the truth that even in darkness, love had not let him go. Laura often caught herself watching Jacob across the dinner table, as if afraid he might vanish again. But then he would smile, a small, tentative smile, and she would know he was still there, still fighting, still choosing life. Michael, too, began to soften. The anger that had weighed on him gave way to something else, pride. Not in himself, but in Jacob for surviving the unimaginable. Reporters eventually moved on to other stories. The neighborhood gossip faded, but for the Millers, the story never really ended. It lived in their walls, their memories, their scars. And yet, it also lived in their laughter, in the quiet evenings together, in the simple miracle of sharing space again. Years later, Jacob would walk once more into Progressive Field, not as a missing boy, not as a shadow in the crowd, but as a man beside his parents. He stood at the same aisle where his cap had once fallen to the sticky floor. The crowd roared around them. Fireworks painted the sky, and Jacob whispered, almost to himself, "I'm still here." And that, perhaps, was the truest ending of all, because this was not only a story of disappearance. It was a story of endurance, of a family broken but never destroyed, of love that refused to let go. Jacob Miller had vanished at a baseball game. 17 years later, he was found. And though time had stolen much, it had not stolen everything. Somewhere in the noise of 30,000 cheering fans, one family finally heard the sound they had been waiting for, the echo of hope, alive again.